Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry, joined as always by
Annie Berglund. Hey, Sam, Unit 3 flies by in just a few days. Do you have any advice for your students?
Yeah, I mean, we're already halfway through this unit, and what you've noticed is that we're halfway through the unit. We've only done one film and one museum. So that means what we have left is one more film and one more museum before the exam. So this is a much smaller unit than we had in the previous ones, although they're pretty dense. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of events. We're covering a shorter period of time, looking at the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment into the modern age. So my biggest piece of advice would be, basically make sure you stick with this. Right, this is not a great time to skip an assignment, take a day off or things like that, because this test is going to come really quick. So I would start working on that study guide right away. Make sure you have your notes down, you have your notes organized. As always, if you have questions about things, you can feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to talk through things that you don't understand. But yeah, this unit is just going to be done quickly, and then we just have one more assignment after the exam. Annie, we've been talking about the scientific revolution in these first couple days. If you had to pick just one scientific revolution reading that you want students to master, which one is it, and why is it Galileo?
I love that you didn't really give me a choice, but I will say that Galileo is a wonderful reading to understand because it's emblematic of this big shift we see during the scientific revolution. So what we see is this rise in science and reason in the West, and it's markedly different from where we were coming from the medieval world. In the medieval world, the universe is set up with the Earth at the center, and the rest of the universe is ordered in these perfect spheres. And you kind of have this physical versus heaven distinction, that the Earth is made of a different substance from those heavenly bodies. And this was a church, or both an idea that was substantiated by the church and also scientists of the time, because the church relied heavily on scripture as showing us that our relationship to God puts us at the center of the universe. And with Galileo, we see in his reading this shift to this elevation of the scientific method, to saying that collecting data and experimenting and observing the world around us, using new technologies like the telescope, those help us to observe the Earth as well as heavenly bodies, and to see that actually there are imperfections beyond the world, and that these heavenly bodies aren't made of a different substance. Moons have craters, like the stuff in the heavens is made up of matter, and that is really controversial for the time. And even the idea that the Earth is not the center of the universe anymore, and like maybe there isn't even a center point in the universe. So Galileo gets in trouble with the church. The church is saying, like, God put us at the center because of our relationship with Jesus. And Galileo is saying basically, like, there is no center. And so his reading is really important, not only because it shows us this marked shift, but also because it shows us the fallout for Galileo himself, saying like, well, now Galileo is facing trial with the church over his observations, that the church had been so much in control of how people view the natural world around them, that these scientific findings felt like they were threatening what the church believed to be true based on biblical understanding and interpretation. And I think it's also important because Galileo is a person of faith. In his reading, he said science doesn't need to and shouldn't replace faith or the Bible, but that both are really important to understand the world and to understand God's creation and to understand God himself. There's a really interesting quote I have, which is on, I think, page about 147 in the reader, but it says, "The Holy Bible can never speak untruth whenever its true meaning is understood, but it is often very difficult to understand. Hence, in expounding the Bible, if one were always to confine oneself to the literal meaning, one might fall into error." So basically, like, the church is wrong to use scripture to defend antiquated beliefs on science. And that gaining knowledge is sometimes going to happen through method and not through just blindly understanding church authority or tradition, or looking just to scripture as a scientific textbook. So I think that those are some of the main reasons why Galileo's reading is so important. Like, he's a person who's in transition. You can see how much he values his faith, but also values the scientific method as a valid form to understand the world around him. Sam, if you had to pick just one scientific revolution reading that you'd want students to master, which is it, and why is it Pascal?
I love Pascal. Even when I was a student, this was one of my favorite readings. What interests me about Pascal is, like with Galileo, he is somebody who is a scientist. He's a mathematician. He's also a devout Christian. Now, what's interesting about Galileo is, or excuse me, interesting about Pascal is that he sort of sees what's happening in the scientific revolution. He's writing in the mid 1600s, so sort of between Galileo and Newton. But even though we're not to Newton yet, like you can tell where things are headed, right? You can tell that it's only a matter of time before there's going to be scientific explanations to some of these things. And Pascal is very concerned about the world becoming a world where the only currency is going to be science and reason. And he's worried, like, is there a space for religion in this? We see someone like Rene Descartes, a fellow French philosopher, mathematician, Christian at the same time, is kind of stripping away notions of faith, not because he thinks faith is important, but because he thinks it's not going to be useful in a world that only looks to science and reason. So people like Descartes are saying what we need to do is turn faith into reason, because then we can actually communicate in the marketplace of ideas. But Pascal is looking at someone like Descartes, or anybody who's embracing sort of whole hog this notion of everything needs to be reason, and saying we need to be careful, because if we turn everything into reason, we lose something. That there are aspects of religion that can't be explained through reason. There's aspects of reality that can't be explained through reason. When you look at that Pascal reading, pay attention to how much he talks about the heart. You hear that word come up a lot, because Pascal is talking about different ways of knowing. He's saying that we know things in our minds, right? Pascal, again, mathematician, philosopher, like we know things in our mind, but he also talks about the heart, and he's making the case that we know things in our hearts as well. And he's saying this is where reason exists, and the heart, this is where faith exists. And he says there's things we know through the heart, there's things we know through faith that reason will never be able to fully understand. He has this great line, the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know what to make of. So he's saying faith is actually a different kind of knowledge. It transcends reason, right? That it's there are things that we know that way. And Pascal is saying we need to maintain a world where we hold and value both of those things as ways of knowing, and they don't need to be mutually exclusive. They don't need to communicate with each, or to contradict each other. He actually thinks that if we strip those things away from religion, someone like Descartes is killing the very thing he's trying to save. Descartes wants to save religion by turning it into reason, and Pascal is saying, no, like, if you do that, the thing you've saved is no longer the thing you were trying to save. You've changed it too much. So I like him because he's a moderating force in this debate. And he's trying to carve a middle ground. And I think that that's really important and really significant. And he's like the pietist that we looked at in Unit 2. He is thinking about religious knowledge, but also thinking about religious experience as well. So he's somebody that I've always found myself really drawn to. Annie, we're talking a lot about science here. Us humanities types, we're a couple of historians. We find ourselves when we teach gen ed courses and we talk with our colleagues, we're constantly trying to convince students who are majoring in the sciences that it's really important that they study things like history and philosophy and theology. So let's flip this question around, though, Annie. As good, honest scholars, let's flip this around and say, why should non-scientists, why should us humanities folks study fields like biology, chemistry, and physics?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two main reasons. So the first is that people in different disciplines do things differently and they solve problems differently. And so when you are somebody who's studying both the humanities and the sciences, you tend to have a pretty good set of tools to help you approach problems from different angles, whether that's looking at like data and numerical information for a problem, or looking at a more human specific individual situation. But being able to combine those different tools makes it easier to solve problems. But also, I think there's something universal about problem solving as well, and approaching information. And so, for example, this year I sat in on a 7th grade biology class with some of my students who need learning support, and I relearned 7th grade biology. And as the second adult in the room, one that is not fluent in the language of science, I felt like I am relearning information that is so important, not just for me, but for my students, to see how do we approach a problem through the scientific method. Well, what does that look like? Well, first we have to have a problem, or first we have to have an idea or an assumption about something, and then we build out and we solve and we see, oh, well, is my assumption true or not true? And I think that that is a really powerful methodology, especially for students to be reminded of, to not just simply take everything as fact or as established, but instead to approach it from a perspective of, well, I need to really prove that this is true, or I need to be able to show through evidence that this thing that I believe in stands, right? And so I think that those bits are really important. I think it's also just marrying the two, the humanities and the sciences, is only ever going to help you more and more in the work field too. I used to work at the Minnesota Senate, and there were countless laws that would be proposed, and they would be about maybe environmental law. And they were embedded in those a lot of important scientific knowledge, but also how does that affect humanity? And so being able to look at both of those ideas in one is essential. It's so important, especially for your undergrad education, but for the workplace too. So Sam, for your last Poodle video response, we want you to reflect on your own experience with science classes, due tomorrow at 10 a.m. Can you get us started, Sam? What was your experience with science in high school and college? And did you wrestle with the relationship between science and your faith, like we've seen with some authors this unit?
I think it's an interesting question, and I'm excited to hear students' responses, mostly because as I've gotten to know you folks over the course of this summer, um, you're definitely coming from very different religious backgrounds. I mean, even within the realm of Christianity, different sets of kind of formative religious experiences, religious traditions. So for me, when I think about high school, there's actually a CWC connection here as I think about this. But so I grew up Catholic. I attended Catholic schools, all the way through high school graduation, and we weren't explicitly told this, but when I look back on what we learned and how we studied science, I realized how Thomistic we were, and that's a fancy way of saying we approached this like Thomas Aquinas did. That there was this sense of like there wasn't this tension between science and Christianity, because there is this sort of all truth is God's truth kind of element that, we looked at human reason, we looked at science as like these are ways of knowing, and when you're studying those things, you are studying God's creation, right? So to the degree we were Thomistic, we were also Aristotelian, because St. Thomas was Aristotelian in that way. So I don't think I had a strong sense of a real tension between those things. There was more of this all truth is God's truth kind of model for me as I was growing up. And even when I came to Bethel, I think I both approached it that way, and I think I took one science course, but I took a lot of math courses when I was here, and I feel like my instructors approached math and science in that same kind of way. Maybe not through an Aquinas type lens, but through this notion of like when we study the physical world, when we study kind of quantitative ideas, we really are studying the work of God in that. So kind of like Galileo was saying, right? Galileo says that the nature is a book authored by God. So I feel like those things were actually pretty informative to the people who were teaching me. Students, that is your poodle question. So we kind of want to just hear about your experience, right? Like, what was that like growing up? Did you experience tension? Is that something that you felt like you needed to wrestle with? Is it something you felt like you needed to resolve? Is it something that sort of came to you already resolved? And how was it resolved? And I'm curious if you're able to unpack a little bit, like, why do you think that was? Why do you think whatever traditions you were part of culturally, religiously, educationally, maybe shaped the way that those things were approached? And what I like about this question is there's no right or wrong answer. It's just sort of sharing your experience. And I know I've said this before, but for this one, really, like, listen to what other people post. I mean, the videos are relatively short, but like, I think it's interesting to hear how different people have had those experiences. All right, students, that's all the time that we have for this first segment. We're going to be back in just a few seconds to play our final game of Make the Case. All right, we are back. We're going to play our third and final game of Make the Case. Now, Annie, we've had 4 competitions throughout this semester. You won the first one. I won the second one. We tied the third time. And then in our fourth game, our last food chain, I actually beat you unanimously. So I think not having Martin Luther on your food chain kind of crushed you there. So thank you, students, for realizing that that was a big mistake by her. But this is your chance. You need to win today, or I win the competition even before we get to the last one. So so for the sake of drama, people are pulling for you to win, and they're going to be the ones who get to vote. So our first question, we have our envelopes here. Our first question, true or false, Isaac Newton is the single most important person we talk about in this course. Let's have true go first.
Okay, sounds good.
Let's see what we
All
got.
right.
Oh, you have true.
Hey, good. This is the one I wanted. This is so high stakes for me. I truly don't win anything. So I'm really gonna just be like asking for votes here. I will pay you. So Isaac Newton is the single most important person we talk about in this course. Yes, 100% I believe that that is true. It is a paradigm shift. And we talk in this class about paradigm shifts. Sometimes I feel like I mention them so often that does it really have a meaning anymore? But it does in Isaac Newton. This is truly a different way of seeing the world around you. So he explains how the world works, right? Through the laws of gravity, through the laws of nature. And in fact, I think I'm going to use a definition by our own Sam Mulberry to explain the law of nature and why it's so important. So Sam has defined it as the universal principle, knowable through reason, which predicts regularity in nature. Is that right, Sam?
That's very good.
Thank you. I have it written down so I don't forget it. And so when a principle is universal, it means it's true no matter what, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter when you are, has been true for all time and will continue to be true. What does that allow us to do in the world? If we can figure out that there are universal principles in the laws of nature, that helps us to predict what the future will be like. If something is knowable through reason, what does that mean? It means that we can use our minds, our intellect, our reason, and methodology in order to find these principles, these universal principles of nature. And so really what Isaac Newton does is he ushers in this new era where the way we understand the world around us and how things change is actually something that we can measure. We can see it. It's rational. It provides a scientific explanation for anything and everything. This is truly the end of the old way and the start of the new way. Like there is time before Newton and there is time after Newton. That's how important he is. And he also kind of kicks off this idea of the Enlightenment as well. So if the laws of nature exist in the sciences, could they not also exist in other things, in other aspects of society as well, in politics, in society, in economics, in art, in music even? Like, how do each of these things work? Maybe we can break them down and find universal laws to help explain all these other aspects of society rather than just science. Like, can we predict human behavior? We have people in the Enlightenment era who try really hard to do so. People like Adam Smith and John Locke are trying to interpret the world around them by looking into, well, are there principles for how life works and how people generally respond to things? And can we look at humanity and find out whether that's true or untrue. So I think that Newton is foundational for the scientific revolution, for shaping the sciences and also ushering in this new era of post-scientific revolution, post-enlightenment that we live in today. Sam, why do you think it's false?
Well, this is tough because like I like to make the case of true, but now I get to make the opposite case. Now, it's my first point is going to be a weird one because Annie, can you help me out? When did Isaac Newton like publish his Principia?
Oh, I'm not sure of the exact date. Can you tell me the exact date?
It's like 1687, right?
Okay.
So that's a little while ago. I want to say this though. The Newton thing is a little bit of recency bias, which sounds silly when we're talking about something from the 17th century here in the 21st century. But there is this sense of he seems really, really important because we are living, to your point, in a Newtonian, in a post-Newton world, right? Newton does shape the world that we live in. But if I want to think about painting with a broad enough brush, I mean, if we even look at the sciences, as we go into the 20th century, into the 21st century, even some principles of Newtonian physics are getting overturned as we go deeper and deeper and smaller and smaller. I mean, we watched Oppenheimer last year, right? That they were doing things and exploring things that we don't fully understand. Now, we don't study those people in this course, so they're not my answer for who's more important. But what I want to point out there is that Newton does present a shift, but as you pointed out, it's not the only paradigm shift in this course, and it is just the most recent major one. So I think that's a piece of it. We could go back to other periods of time and say we are living in a world that is created by this person or this. I mean, the last word in science before Newton was Aristotle, right? Like, so he had a pretty good run there too. And Aristotle, if we were answering this question in the 1200s, you can make a pretty great case that Aristotle might be the most important person we studied in this course. Now, I'm not going to make the case that it's Aristotle, but there are people that we could think about. Now, the other thing I want to say in terms of why I think it's not Newton is that this course, if you've been paying attention, we've been showing you lots of different historical approaches to thinking about these big questions. Who am I and who should I be? What is my relationship to others? How do I answer questions? What methods or authorities do I look to? And how do Christians relate to culture around us? Now, Newton is significant because he presents one argument that grows into a fairly polar argument, right? Newton isn't necessarily saying it's all reason, but the world he creates definitely pushes in that direction. The Enlightenment moves in that direction. Modernity moves in that direction. Arguably, postmodernity is going to ask some questions about that. But so we get one answer from him. So I want to think about what are other answers, right? So I think about Plato and Augustine being pretty important. I would point to Augustine over Plato because if this is Christianity and Western culture, we need to think about how do Christians relate to culture. Newton he's giving an answer to some of those questions about knowledge and authority, but there's a little bit of punting on Christianity there where Augustine is really trying to wrestle with changes, paradigm shifts that are recent in his world. So I would say somewhere in the axis between Constantine and Augustine is actually the most important person. I'm going to make the case for Constantine. Going back to Unit 1, I'll try to do this quick because you all know this stuff. The world for Christians fundamentally changes in 313. We get this shift from thinking about the church as this small, poor, relatively powerless in terms of worldly power thing to becoming rich, powerful, comfortable, in control of the most powerful empire and the most powerful army in the world. That happens within like a 20-25 year period. We see that shift, and ever since then we are still living in a post-Constantinian world. Newton doesn't change that. Newton doesn't change the fact that power, privilege, comfort in this world is tied to Christianity in the West in lots and lots and lots and lots of ways to this very day. So I think if we want to talk about paradigm shifts, yes, Newton's a big one, but I think Constantine is probably an even bigger one because we haven't been able to shake that, and that's not recent. That's 1700 years ago. All right, should we do question number 2?
Let's do it.
All right, question number 2. Pascal wants to know, which is the more important problem for Christians in a scientific age? To submit everything to reason or to offend the principles of reason? So I will go first on this one. And I have submit everything to reason. So I'm going to argue that that Pascal's biggest problem is the idea of, this goes back to what I talked about in segment 1. So I kind of mowed my own lawn then, right? There is this sense that what Pascal is concerned about is what happens when we turn faith into reason, when we turn religion into reason. We end up with a God that exists within the bounds of reason. And when I say exists within the bounds of reason, what I'm also saying is exists within the limitations of reason. That God must fit within this rational framework. That there isn't the ability for that to be broken out of. You lose the sense of the mysterious, the miraculous, right? I mean, and then you start to think about core notions of Christianity, and they involve some things that are transrational, right? That go beyond reason. God becoming flesh, Christ's resurrection, right? These are things that don't fit within the world of reason. So you lose those things if you submit everything to reason. I would even argue some of the teachings of Christ seem to transcend reason. Let's think about the Sermon on the Mount, right? Christ tells us, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, right? Like, there's a degree to which Christ is not speaking cold-heartedly, rationally there. He's transcending reason, and he's saying, actually, I'm calling you to something that goes beyond reason. I'm calling you to love the person who hates you. That's not a rational decision. That's something that goes beyond that. And I think if we start to submit everything to reason, we start by eliminating things like the miraculous, the mysterious, the mystical. And we might say, like, okay, I'm a scientific person, I feel that way. But don't we quickly start to then also move our ethics and morality in that direction as well? And do we maybe even start to question some of those other tenets? Like, well, why would I love the person who hates me? Why would I pray for the person who persecutes me? So I think that is a huge danger. And I think it's a more real danger than what you're going to be asked to argue, Andy. You're going to be asked to argue, that it's more dangerous to get rid of reason altogether. But it's like, I don't even know if we're capable of that. I don't know if we're capable of actually entirely abandoning reason. So I'm going to hand this over to you, feeling like the case I made is what I need to make.
Sure. And I value that case, Sam, but here's why I think that offending the principles of reason is something that is a slippery slope. So it's not always just about tossing out reason entirely. Like you said, I don't think that that's something we can really do. But what happens when we prioritize faith over the principle of reason in every single pursuit? I think that there are certainly elements of faith that are so important, like you were saying, the spiritual, the personal type of faith that we feel that transcends reason, that goes beyond the mind, something that can just touch our heart. But I think that there is also a really important aspect to prioritizing reason as well. And I think the end goal could be looking at, well, how do we explain Christianity to people who are not Christian, people who have not maybe experienced a conversion of the heart, that maybe their first step is trying to understand Christianity from the conversion of their mind. I know there were some of my friends, even at Bethel, who were not sure about Christianity, and some of what they needed was to be converted in the mind first. There were some hurdles that they faced that they thought, I cannot get over this bit or this bit, on how these things don't make sense in my head. I need to understand that before I can understand, or before I can accept that this is a reality, before I can even be converted in my heart. So I think that one of the big points of, or one of the slippery slopes of elevating faith beyond the level of reasoning in all situations is that we end up with this concern of, well, how do we communicate our faith to people who are not in our faith? sometimes that requires reason. In fact, many times it does. So if you think about like a Christian scholar and a non-Christian scholar, and let's say they're debating something, who knows, some topic of controversy, specifically in science or the humanities, but it's not like a strictly theological debates. You have somebody who is not a theologian or not a practicing Christian or person of faith. Well, are they going to accept points from the Christian scholar that are just straight from scripture or from their theological understanding? Like you need to be able to back up your argument through reason in order for this non-Christian scholar to even accept that this is adequate proof, if not just accept that this is a conversation that makes sense in their world, right? And so I think that the prioritizing of faith over reason becomes an issue if we're thinking about it in terms of like a debate or an argument, but also in like pairing up and learning from secular discourse as well. I think Christians need reason, right? It's not just for converting somebody else or convincing somebody else of why my faith is also reasonable, but it's also for my own understanding of scripture, of the context of the Bible, of the natural world around me, and also just being able to have these dialogues and conversations with people of diverse backgrounds in order for me to understand my own faith better, and for it to make sense in like the marketplace of ideas. So that's why I would argue the opposite of you, Sam.
That's a pretty good argument. I'm going to grant you that. Third question. Kant wants to know, which is the bigger obstacle to enlightenment, cowardice or laziness? Let's have lazy go first.
Okay, this is like my favorite question of the whole class.
All right.
I love this. Sorry, you said laziness or cowardice?
Laziness goes first, and I am laziness.
All right.
All right. So why is laziness such a big threat to enlightenment, such a big obstacle to enlightenment for Kant? Well, Kant is going to argue that we have reason, and he's writing in the late 1700s saying, we've had basically a century of enlightenment, of the enlightenment happening, but he says we're not enlightened, and the reason we're not enlightened is because we're lazy. Now, what he means by this is that if enlightenment is defined by having the courage to use your own reason, to use your own understanding, the problem is using your own understanding, using your own reason, thinking for yourself. And not just like, throwing out an answer, but like doing the work of like, okay, let's try to figure out, here's a question. How do I use my reason, use the tools I have to try to come to a good answer to that question? That it takes a lot of work. And not only does it take a lot of work, but we are surrounded by people who would be happy to think for us, who would be happy to say, oh, you don't need to think about this. Let me just tell you what it is. I would say, there's a degree to which your teachers, like you should, I'm going to say you shouldn't trust your teachers, but there is a degree to which you should question things. You should say like, okay, well, you said this idea, you made this case about, submitting everything to reason. It's like, well, you should think for yourself that, do you really agree with that or not? Like the key is we should think for ourselves. And Kant says we're surrounded by people who are willing to think for us. And it's so much easier to do that. It's so much easier to just say like, well, this is what this person said, and they seem like they know what they're saying, so I'm going to go along with that. And he says that is the obstacle to enlightenment, is that we are too lazy to put in that work. And it is work day in, day out to use your reason, to think for yourself. But he says if we're ever to be truly enlightened, that's the first step, is to overcome that. Annie, make your case.
Okay, why is cowardice the biggest obstacle to the Enlightenment? At my school I work at, we have many core values that our students are supposed to be exemplifying. So things like honesty and responsibility and compassion. But one of the core values that undergirds all of that is courage. Like it takes courage to step out in situations and show compassion, especially to somebody who maybe it's difficult to show compassion to. It takes courage to be honest. It takes courage to take responsibility for something that you did wrong, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And I think the same goes for enlightenment, for educating ourselves. There's this phrase called cognitive dissonance, right? This idea that like I have my long-standing beliefs, and when something comes in with a different belief, I feel this kind of tension within me. Do I accept that things might be different from what I believed before? Or do I retreat back into my comfort? Do I say, oh, no, and act in sometimes stubbornness and say, no, I know that this is true. I don't need to think about that other aspect over there. I don't need to question what I had already learned or what I had already assumed to be true. And so I think that challenging these longstanding beliefs and questioning authority, even my own authority, takes courage. And sometimes it's going to be facing hardships or facing punishment. We see that in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. People who branch out and establish new ways of thinking are often met with some pretty difficult trials in their life, even sometimes legitimate, real trials by the state or the church. So I think that one of the biggest obstacles to enlightenment is this idea of like, if I reject this this freedom of this emancipation, like you said, of understanding the truth, for comfort or for ease or for not having to go out and address some of the things I believe might be wrong, well, that all comes down to a lack of courage. It's more comfortable. I don't need to face any intellectual discomfort. And so I think one of the argument for cowardice as being the worst, the biggest obstacle, is that cowardice is what prevents you from making that first step. Yes, laziness is the reason why we don't put in effort, we don't make a pattern, but it's that first step that is the most important. When I think about goals I've made in my life, whether it's like a physical goal, like physical wellness, or an intellectual goal, what I need to do first is the first step. I can't just say, okay, I'm going to go run 5 miles every day for the next, 2 weeks, and I'm going to be physically fit now. I need to be able to have the courage to take the first step. And often that's a small step. And yes, I need to put in effort and make practice and make it a habit. But if I'm not willing to do the first thing and to step out, that's going to cause me to never address the thing that I want to change in myself, or never address the inaccuracies in what I believe around the world, or my misunderstandings of the things that I thought to be true. So I think cowardice is the first step, or cowardice prevents us from that first step of courage in facing these sometimes uncomfortable truths in the Enlightenment.
I love your analogy to getting out and running, but it sure seems like laziness would be the thing that would keep us from making the first step. We'll see. Students, this is your opportunity to tell us. So right under this video is a link for you to vote. You get to vote on each one of these questions. Who made the best case? It really matters to us. So go in there, vote. It takes, probably 10 seconds of your time, but we need to know your thoughts on this. And if you want to vote for Annie because you want the drama of the last game, that's okay, even though I made really compelling arguments.
Wow.
So even if I lose, I have a built-in excuse.
Cheapening my win.
That's what I'm here for. All right, that's all the time that we have. We'll be back in a few seconds to wrap up the show. And we're back. Time is short, but it's just enough time for happy times. Happy birthday to Daniel Radcliffe. The English actor turns 35 today. I don't know how I feel about that. Radcliffe came to prominence playing the titular role of, I'm seeing here, Harry Potter in the Harry Potter film series. Annie, what's the best Harry Potter movie?
Okay, to be fair, we were talking about this off air. Favorite movie's easy, or sorry, favorite book is easy. For me, it's book number 3, Prisoner of Azkaban, but also book 5 and 6 are great. Movies are a little harder for me to pin down. I'm not like super fan of many of them, but I will say that Richard Harris as Dumbledore, so much better than Michael Gambon. Is that his name?
Mm-hmm.
Michael Gambon's Dumbledore. And I think that's a hot take. He was real low energy. He was near the end of his life, but he was such a sweet old man, and you just wanted him to like give you, I don't know, hot chocolate or whatever Dumbledore does to make you feel better. So I'm gonna go ahead and say the first and second movies because of Richard Harris. Also check out his great track, MacArthur Park.
You have to pick between 1 and 2 though, because I said favorite movie. Go with 2. It's more fun to say 2 is the best.
That's true. I mean, it has the cool snake thing in it too. So like, that's whatever that was called.
The basilisk.
Thank you, the
I'm a
basilisk.
nerd.
All right, 2. So happy anniversary to typewriters. On this day in 1829 AD, William Austin Burt patented the typographer, a precursor to the typewriter. Sam, what's the longest thing you've ever written on a typewriter?
Annie, I am here to tell you I am old enough to have written a paper in probably junior high on a typewriter. So we didn't have a computer. I mean, computers existed. We didn't have one. So I have written a full-on, probably, I don't know, probably 3.5, 4-page paper on a typewriter, which is as annoying as it sounds. I also probably wrote a 2-page paper on a typewriter that wasn't even an electric typewriter. It was a fully mechanical typewriter, which is as much work as it's more work than it sounds like. So let's all just be thankful we're not writing on typewriters. And here's the thing, you may have romanticism about it. I know Tom Hanks does. And they are kind of cool. At the same time, if you're a bad speller, if you're somebody who needs to edit their writing a lot, typewriters are kind of a problem. So I'm happy to have anything else to help me write. Finally, happy trails to Sally Ride. The American astronaut died on this day in 2012 at the age of 61. In 1983, Ride became the first American woman to go to space. Annie, did you grow up dreaming of space travel? And if offered the chance, would you go to space today?
I think because I wasn't a child of like the 70s and 80s, I've never really wanted to go to space. I feel like it's something more like inevitable that if humans do have to go in mass, it's not going to be like because of a good thing or an exciting thing. It's going to be like, oh, this is our last resort. Also grew up a pretty cautious child, hate sledding, hate skateboarding, hate anything going fast or up or down. So I feel like this isn't for me. Sam, if you want to go in my stead, I'd be happy to have you
To
do
say
that.
thank you for dumping water on my childhood dreams. I did grow up in the 80s, and yes, space was definitely something I thought I would do by the time I was Daniel Radcliffe's age of 35. I thought for sure I would, and I'm not like I'm gonna be like a scientist astronaut. I just thought we'd all be there by then, because
Oh.
it sure felt like that when I was really little. And yeah, some things happened, and turns out we haven't been there. I haven't been there. Students, that is all the time that we have. Remember to complete your Poodle assignment for tomorrow by 10 a.m. Let us know your experiences in high school and college, but particularly high school. I'm interested in with the sciences. Was there a tension between faith and reason? How did you resolve that? How did you think about that? Did you have to wrestle with that? So post your video to Poodle by 10 a.m. Watch each other's videos. I think these are going to be really interesting. We will be back later this week for the final webisode before your last exam. Say goodnight, Stacy.